It's perfectly natural for palm biologists to think of birds as seed dispersers or seed predators even. But for ornithologists like me, palms mean an awful lot more than just food. As I hope is clear from the abstract, today's talk then will not emphasize frugivory, but in fact other aspects of the relationship between palms and birds. For example, monodominant palm stands as habitat for birds, a particular palm species as offering microhabitat or limiting resources for birds, and palm species as indicators of bird habitat. Of course, we ornithologists do recognize that a lot of birds eat palm fruits, and in fact, the palms that we are most likely to learn are those that birds eat, and they're the classic frugivorous birds like parrots and toucans and cotingas and tanagers and even woodpeckers. But I'd like to start by talking about another kind of phenomenon altogether, and that is habitat specialization. And the Maurice palm, Mauritia flexuosa, is probably the best example of that. It's probably the most famous palm in the Amazon, and where it's known as burichi and forms burichisais, big stands of Maurice palms, and in the Cerrado, where it forms veredas, and attracts a lot of fruit-eating creatures. But also, there are at least 6 species of birds that are considered specialized on Maurice palm swamps. They come from all different kinds of families. Many times they even have palm in their name, in the common name in English. And I'd like to run through some of these examples because they're neat cases. Of course, the blue and yellow macaw and the red-bellied macaw at the top of your screen are tightly associated with Maurice palm swamps. They eat the fruit, and they also nest in the hollow dead trees, as do many other species of parrots, like the white-eyed parakeet below, and many species of parrots also nest in the hollow dead trunks of other palm species. But the really classic example of Maurice palm specialization is the point-tailed palm creeper. This pretty little bird is in the Furnariid family, a family known for being predominantly, if not exclusively, insectivorous. And so they're not eating burichi fruit, or at least not much, probably. But they never leave Maurice palms. They spend their entire life cycle in these palms. They rarely even appear in view. They make their nests in the base of the leaf petioles and presumably forage on insects. They're called limpa-folha de burichi. They forage on insects within the crown of these palms. Their distribution then is associated very tightly with the distribution of Maurice palm throughout the Amazon and the Cerrado biomes. Another really cool example is the fork-tailed palm swift. This bird, again, is also tightly associated with Maurice palm swamps. It builds its nests in the dead hanging fronds on the tree, makes the nests of feathers from other birds. And until recently, it wasn't known how it got those until very cleverly, my friend Brett Whitney actually carefully observed these birds ripping the feathers out of the backs of other birds as they flew over Maurice palm swamps. In fact, probably scaring away potential seed dispersers in the process. So in the Amazon and in the Cerrado, they nest exclusively in Maurice palms, but they also occur in the Caatinga in the northeast of Brazil, where they use another species of palm, the carnaúba, Copernicia prunifera, which architecturally is very similar looking actually, and most importantly, has this these dead leaves hanging that persist, are useful nest sites. And it's just exactly this sort of grass skirt of dead leaves that presumably is what makes them attractive to the birds, a place, sort of a thatched roof under which to build their nests. So they occur in the Amazon, in the Cerrado, in Maurice palms, and in the northeast of Brazil in the Caatinga biome in Copernicia, where also in cities they've now taken to recently nesting in an introduced exotic species, Livistona, which has, again, a similar architecture. The remaining two species, two passerines, the relationship to palms is known, but the nature of the relationship is not clearly documented and be really worth and interesting to study in more detail. Another kind of relationship is with on a smaller scale, particular species of palms, for example, Lepidocarium in the understory, may offer a kind of a microhabitat or some kind of resource that's of relevance to birds. In the case of Lepidocarium tenui, it's a nice understory palm, and I often associate its presence with the presence of any number of specific bird species that don't seem to be using this palm in any way. They're insectivorous also, and they don't all occur together. But where they do occur, if you find Lepidocarium, it's a good indicator that you might find these birds. The nature of this exact relationship remains to be described. Another Mauritia, the Carana palm, Carana, has these really interesting dense fibers, whoops, sorry about that, at the base of the fronds. And this bird, a newly described jay, all of the nests that we found of this species were built of the fibers of the Carana palm. Now, whether it depends on them as a nest material and that's a limiting resource, or whether they just took advantage of it in the places we saw, again, remains to be studied. But in the line of fiber use by birds, the real cool example that no one has studied, no ornithologist has studied, is Leopoldinia piassaba, the piassaba palm that moves a big economy of fiber extraction for making brooms and thatch. And it's impossible for an ornithologist to look at this kind of a structure and know that they form monodominant stands, presumably, and think that there isn't some bird specifically adapted to this, perhaps even a new species that no one's ever found. We do know that the people I've spoken to talk a lot about kissing bugs, the vectors of Chagas disease, being very common in this thatch. So we know that it's got that going for it anyway. But the most important relationship, indirect relationship with birds that I'd like to stress in this talk is palms as indicators of bird habitat. These habitats listed on the left all have unique suites of bird species associated with them, and they're perfectly recognizable to us, and they also have distinct palm species that can be used as indicators. And I'll just go ahead and mention some of the ones that I've found to be useful to help me sort of know where I am in the forest. Upland, non-flooded terra firma forest, has bacaba, and up on plateaus away from the flooding, and that's a nice indicator of places that don't flood. The floodplains, on the other hand, have jawari, Astracarium jawari, which is a nice indicator of places that flood even when there's no water there, but you do have to know how to differentiate it from tucumã, which is a similar species in areas that don't flood. Now, it matters whether the floodplain is flooded by muddy water or black water. This case is a little controversial, perhaps, because what I've been told is called pupunharana. It looks like this, and I guess it's Bactris riparia. I associate with areas that have some kind of sediment load in the water. Now, my deep scholastic research in Google actually mentioned that this palm is associated with black water. That's not my experience. It's associated, in my experience, with places that have sediment input. Classic blackwater palm would be Leopoldinia pulchra, the jara, with this really nifty fibers woven on the trunks. Swampy bottomlands within terra firma forest have distinctive palms as well. And especially important is to be able to recognize if a place has suffered any kind of degradation, and especially burning. Obviously, these pictures show scenes of cattle pasture, but these palms, two Adelaeas, Inaja and Babasu, survive well and respond well to burning. And when they're found in the forest in the high densities, that's an indication that the forest has burned repeatedly, and that has a strong impact on the birds that are present as well. White sand savannas also have distinctive palms associated with them. Now, obviously, they're pretty easy to recognize without knowing anything about palms or birds for that matter. But you might have some doubt about whether an open area in the Amazon is natural or whether it's some kind of cutover area. and the presence of these palms will help to indicate that this is a natural white sand savanna. The transition between the open campo and the forest, it goes through a kind of white sand forest that has unique birds, and the presence of certain palms also help to identify even tall forest that might look superficially like the regular terra firma as being campina, such as this red-sheathed Euterpe caatinga. Cloud forest, again, you probably don't need an indicator to know you're in cloud forest above 1,000 meters with all kinds of clouds and cool air and mosses and low stature. But I want to call attention to this Euterpe-like palm. It looks like a little acai that I see on these tepuis, and I don't know what it is. I haven't been able to figure it out, and if you palm folks could help me identify this, I'd be really pleased. It's an area with fascinating birds and vegetation as well. Finally, even in urban areas, there are lots of exotic ornamental palms, and they also have relationships with birds. A really nifty case is Manaus, where we have now an annual migration of some 10,000 white-winged parakeets that roost in front of a condominium in a row of royal palms that they've actually managed to kill. The birds have killed the palms by roosting in their densely on their fronds and stepping all over them and smushing them and eventually killing the fronds and weakening until death the palms themselves. So just to wrap up, I'd like to call attention to some of the questions, the unanswered questions that I mentioned, and the overarching question of, is the relationship between palms and birds something that benefits the palms as well, or is it strictly one-sided? And as far as distributional similarities, are there common drivers driving both bird and palm distributions? People rarely look at distributional congruence between animals and plants. But some of these palms with more conspicuous palms with more restricted distributions may well, in fact, share common drivers, share distributions with certain birds, and perhaps there are common drivers behind this. Also, the transition from the Amazon forest to the Cerrado is probably marked by clear palm turnover, as it is by bird turnover, and it'd be really interesting to find out to what extent there's concordance between the two sets of organisms. And I do believe that someone who knew more about palms than I do would have any number of other species to suggest as useful indicators of habitat type, such as the pashiubas and even perhaps some stemless palms. I'd like to thank an ex-graduate student of mine, Juliana Menger, who actually showed quantitatively strong relationship between palm species composition and bird species composition in Amazonian forest. Thaisi Emilio, who taught me how to identify a bunch of palms, and the photographers who offered the only good pictures in here. The others are stolen off the internet. Sorry. Thank you very much.